We are live on YouTube. This is Male Entrepreneur Podcast, episode number 187. And we're live in 3, 2. All right, welcome back to the Male Entrepreneur Podcast, the podcast for men who win, with your host, Purdeep Sangha. Purdeep, how you doing today, man?
Hey Nathan, what's up? I'm doing awesome, man. How about yourself?
I'm doing good. For the listeners that don't know, we batch record, so we record a couple of episodes at once, and we had something else lined up for this episode, but I pestered you, and you said, okay, let's do it. I wanted to continue from last week's conversation because there was a lot of stuff that we weren't able to get into. And for the listeners, it's last week. For us, it was just 5 minutes ago. So it's all fresh in my mind. And I had a bunch more questions that I wanted to pick your brain about when it comes to super consciousness or meta-consciousness or genius zone or whatever we want to call it. And we ended the show last week. I asked you about how many of the guys that you work with actually are into this stuff, and you said it was only about half of the guys that you work with that at least currently are into or care about exploring these ideas. And I wanted to, without throwing anybody under the bus, I wanted to ask your opinion about if you noticed anything in guys that triggered them wanting to get into this, or if there was some kind of, after working with people, if you can be like, okay, I feel like this person's about to get to the point, if there's like any clues or similarities between people that make this interesting to them.
Yeah, typically two things happen, and this is what I see. One is they've stumbled upon it in some way, shape, or form. So either they've had some kind of an experience, a real practical experience. Maybe it was a moment of clarity, maybe it was a meditation session, maybe they went on to a retreat, and something happened where they got this revelation, this aha moment that they need to look into this more. And that could be the universe sending them a message.
Mm-hmm.
The second is when they get to the state of being ready to be able to accept this type of information. Because a lot of guys are not ready at this point because they're struggling in some way, shape, or form in their life, right? They're struggling in their relationship or they're struggling in their business. So they're preoccupied with this thoughts of how do I make more money? How do I, not get divorced and lose half my money? How do I be a better for all of these other things that are bogging them down where they don't have the ability to think into this zone? And I think, and not saying that you're in this category, Nathan, but you said something last time. You read it in the book, but it just kind of went over your head. That's because you just weren't at that headspace to be able to accept that information because there's probably something else happening in your life. And so this happens to all of us is when we're not ready, we don't accept the information that might be right in front of us. And I can tell you something. I'm going to speak about this from personal experience. And I've studied this for decades, like energy practices for a long time. And I just had this revelation about 6 months ago that completely changed my life. And it was, how do I explain it? My entire life, I've pushed through, like just through sheer force, grit. If I was tired, I continued to go, even in my workouts, doing my work, whatever it was just sheer force, right? For a lot of big part of my life. In the back of my head, I always said, I got to do something about my energy levels because I also have this condition, a physical biological condition called thalassemia, which is my blood cells are deformed, and what ends up happening is it doesn't take in oxygen. My cells don't take in oxygen and utilize them the way they should. So therefore, I don't have the same level of energy. I remember when I was a kid, I used to be wiped out. I just used to use sheer force, like try to get through things. And I would just wonder, why do the other kids have so much energy where I'm just kind of struggling? Well, long story short, I went through my entire life in the back of my head saying, I wish I had more energy. I wish I had more energy. How do I get more energy? And I was still studying traditional energy practices from the Eastern Society. And I didn't make a connect until about 6 months ago, where I said, I'm using the biological Western ways to try to increase my energy. And I'm studying energy from a different perspective, from a cognitive perspective. from Eastern medicine, trying to increase the energy for my brain, not for my body. And I said, why don't I try using it to increase the energy for my body? And that clicked for me. And I was just like, wow. And this was almost a moment of shame and embarrassment for myself, where I said, I just completely overlooked this for so many years. And it was right in front of me. So this is me saying openly, I'm saying, you know what, if this does not sound relevant to you, if this sounds maybe woo-woo, or if this sounds whatever, at some point in time, there will be that point that it hits home, and you may just slap yourself in the forehead and be like, what was I thinking? But everything happens at the right time.
So I had a guy, his name was Tanuj, and he was into meditation. He wanted me to write a sales page for one of his meditation practices things. And I ended up passing on it for a couple of different reasons. At the time that he hit me up, I wasn't ready to accept some of this stuff as being real. He talked about being able to meditate. He also talked about being able to like manipulate the wind. He said that he could change the direction of the wind, and I thought he was crazy. And then he would go on Facebook Live or YouTube Live, and he would actually do it. And I was just like, there's got to be some kind of trick to this. And one of the things that he got me with, he told me, we were talking, and he said, look, you don't have to believe me. You don't have to believe it, whatever. He's all, but I know that I could tell you something about yourself that nobody be able to tell you about yourself. It's like, just from this conversation, I know that when you were younger, you used to have something where if the phone was going to ring or if someone was going to knock on the door, you would be able to feel it happen a couple of seconds before it happened. And my jaw dropped. I was just like, holy crap. Because that would happen to me all the time when I was younger. I would be like, Christy's going to call for Sarah. And then the phone would ring and it'd be Christy and she'd be asking where Sarah was at. Or someone's going to knock at the door and it's going to be my mom's friend Corinne. And then the door would knock and it would be my mom's friend Corinne. And that happened all the time to me. And it was just like one of those weird things. I didn't really give it too much attention. But then recently I was reading a study about something called telephone telepathy. And they were talking about how they would get someone and they would have 4 different people and they'd say, we're going to have one of these 4 different people call you. And before you pick up the phone, you have to guess. As soon as you hear the phone ring, you have to guess which of these 4 people that you know are calling you. And 1 out of 4, you'd think about 25% of the time they'd be able to guess accurately, but it was like 30, 40, 50, 60% of the time people would know who it was. Statistically improbable that they would know, but they would. And they did it across continents. They did a study in Australia and they did a study in England, or maybe it was London, somewhere in the UK. And they did it with transplants, people that moved from Australia to England. And they said, okay, you live in England, pick 4 people that you've met since you got here. And they would get still above 25%, be 30, 33% of the time they'd get it accurate. But then they said, okay, we're going to have somebody from on another continent, we're going to have 4 people from where you grew up at that you've known for 20, 30 years, and we're going to have them call you. And they're way over there, so they're way further away, so that maybe the connection won't be as strong. We'll see what happens. And it was the opposite. The further away, but the people they were closer with, it would jump. It'd be 40, 50, 60% again. And the idea is that we have some sort of consciousness where we're connected with, especially people that we have a connection with. I've heard stories of like twins. A twin falls and breaks their ankle, and the other twin on the other side of the country gets a sore pain in their ankle, and they're like, uh-oh, something just happened to my twin. And it's almost, with all these studies coming out, I saw another thing about fish and the schools of fish, how they all turn direction at the same time. Well, they've found instances where one fish from the school will kind of straggle off from the school of fish, and they'll be off a quarter mile away, and they'll see a predator and they'll immediately jerk to the right and start swimming off to the right. And at that same time, the rest of the school of fish that doesn't even see the predator, they also all turn off to the right and start swimming off to the right. And it seems like with fish, with birds, the way that birds fly in flocks, it seems like there's this kind of, you mentioned in the last show, like an antenna where our
Hmm.
brains have a consciousness isn't just inside of our head, where we have this antenna connection to others. When you look at the way fish act and you look at the way herds of animals act, it's pretty easy to accept, yeah, there's probably some kind of other communication going on. But as human beings, we're so against the idea. It's we laugh at it. Oh, that's stuff from Ghostbusters, science fiction movies. That's not stuff in real life. So my question is, with so much evidence that there's some sort of communication that goes on outside of just verbal and facial expressions and stuff like that, there's communication that we can see evidence of that happens when people aren't even in the same room. Or I saw another study where they had people with their back to the wall and they would have someone come into the room, and certain people could have their, like, when someone comes in and they affect the whole tone, like the feeling, someone comes in a bad mood and automatically everybody else in the room, their attitude kind of gets lowered or highered. Some people have those strong personalities. Well, they've done studies where they had people walk in and you couldn't even see the person behind you, and they just asked, is the person behind you in a good mood or a bad mood? Do you feel do you feel uplifted, or do you feel pulled down by this person's presence? Not even being able to see the person, and a lot of times people could connect with the feeling of the person behind them without them even seeing them. With so much evidence of this, and our willingness to say, yeah, there's something weird with the way that fish work, there's something weird with the way that birds flock together, but we're not going to consider that human beings have this same kind of ability to connect on some sort of energetic level. I guess a long-winded way to ask, why is it that we're so resistant to this idea?
Well, and when we say we, and you said human beings, not necessarily all human beings. It depends on society and how we've been raised. Because in some cultures, it's normal, right? They think energy practices are part of human life and everyday society. And if you tell them that doesn't exist, they'll look at you like, "What do you mean? You're crazy." So it just depends on where we grew up and what our belief systems are. And science has overtaken the world, right? And there was a saying, and I believe it was, I don't know if it was Einstein, but maybe it was Einstein, where he said, we've become so dependent on science that we've truly forgotten, what genius is really about, right? And that is the difference. So, long story short, here's the other thing too. We've become a commercialized society. If people can't make money off it, then it doesn't go mainstream. And that's the reality of how this world works, right? So, does it exist? Well, I think everybody needs to experience that for themselves. Why is it not as popular as it should be? Because people aren't able to make money off it, except for certain people. There are some people that are capitalizing on this and having retreats, um, and telling you can manifest stuff just by going on these retreats and doing stuff like that. Do I believe in some of that stuff? Think yes. Some are just straight up thieves, some of these people that hold these types of retreats. The other thing too is we um we have depended so much on science in the last 100 years that we are blind to a lot of other things now. And my wife, so I do qigong practices every morning. And this is how we operate as human beings. My wife believes in energy. She's experienced it herself in a number of different things that we've done. And she asked me, she's like, oh, you're doing these practices all the time. And she said, do you feel the energy? And I looked at her and I said, because she's like, is what you're doing actually working? I said, can you open up your phone for a sec? I said, do your emails work? And she said, yeah. I said, do you feel Wi-Fi? And she said, no.
Mm.
And she kind of got the point there. And this is someone, she believes in it. So we always have this skeptical side inside of us. There's times even within me, I'm like, isn't I just crazy? Like, am I just nuts? Am I the only person that thinks this way? Maybe I might be one of those, 0.1% that is just cuckoo and I don't and I just don't think I'm cuckoo, right? So I don't think it's ever going to become mainstream to the point where it's going to be generally accepted if people are thinking that there's a collective genius out there. But I think it will become more mainstream, and especially maybe science will get to the point where they say, yeah, this does exist. But here's some of the other studies. They know this, but again, it hasn't been widely commercialized, where you can sit there and they know when two people, you can put them on opposite ends of the room and one person's heartbeat actually influences the other person's heartbeat.
Hmm.
Like there's a wave now that they're actually showing, science is actually showing there's like a 3 meter wave that our heart actually emits,
Wow.
like which is absolutely crazy when you think about it, right? And so our hearts, how we think, that's why we say we should think through our heart, because our heart has the ability to actually heal, has the ability to connect with other people. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, there's a lot out there. There's a lot of research, but because we haven't, a lot of people haven't commercialized it, it's going to continue to be a small percentage of people that only know about this and only utilize it. Let's just think, Nathan, practically, you and I, right? We're avid learners, and we still don't know everything that's out there, a fraction of the stuff that's out there, even in
Mhm.
this world. So, as much as we like to dig, there's so much more information. So, it's like opening up a can of worms, and that can never ends.
So you kind of opened up a can of worms. You talked about manifestation and money, and I this is again a completely anecdotal personal experience, and I'm not going to say it's because of this, but it is something that recently was something that kind of raised my uh, raised a little flag in my consciousness. I had a really good day in business a while back, and it was I just took it on a new client, and it was a client that I love working for, and we had just negotiated that day. We had just negotiated what they were going to bring me on for, and it was a pretty significant amount of money. I was super stoked about it, and then throughout that same day, I had like 4 or 5 sales of one of my digital products that also was not a very cheap product. And so I got a at the beginning of the day, the first thing in the morning, I have this meeting. I negotiate a really good salary for myself with a new client. Throughout the day, I have like 4 or 5 sales of, or 3 or 4 sales of a pretty high end, high ticket item that I sell. And then just randomly, this lady, I'm at the supermarket, and this lady just gives me money. She's just like, "Hey, I want to give you the," it was like $30. It wasn't anything big, but I'm with my friend, and he's like, "Why did that lady give you money?" It was like $36 or something. She just gives it to me. And I was like, "Dude, I don't know." He goes, "That's weird. Like, do you know her?" And I was like, "No." And then I started thinking about it. I was like, dude, this morning I negotiated a really good salary for myself. Throughout the day, I've gotten 4 notifications about selling a high ticket item. And then this lady just walks up and randomly hands me like $35, $36. And it was just weird because it felt like in that day, I was just in this, just money kept flying at me out of, and it started out from that negotiation. And then just throughout the day, it just seemed like I was a receiver for money that day. And that was one of the things where I was like, okay, there's something weird going on. I need to start paying attention to these little signs that are happening. And maybe it's just coincidence, but when you mentioned manifestation and stuff like that, I tend to just write that stuff off. But I've had days like that where just good stuff, whether it was money or whether it's people reaching out that I haven't heard from in a while, and 3 people reach out in one day, or sometimes, something bad happens and I'm in a bad mood, and bad stuff just keeps happening throughout the day. Like my mind is like a tuning fork, and depending on how I tune it, resonates and attracts more of that same tune into my life throughout the day. And maybe I'm completely crazy. I wanted to get your take on that though.
No, and this is, I don't think there's an exact science to it, but I think you're onto something, because there is something to be said about manifestation. If you take a look at it from a general perspective, people who don't expect stuff typically don't get it, and they're not open to it. So when you are open to it and you're connecting to it, um, you're more likely to actually get it, and you're actually more likely to be aware of it and be conscious of it. And so opportunity, for example, people who are closed off to opportunities seldom don't get those opportunities. The people that are open to it will find the opportunities, right? And so that's one thing from a practical perspective. The other thing is, if you take a look at everything, what they've shown through science, and this is not we're not talking about woo-woo stuff here. You talk to the physicists out there, we are made up of energy and space. 99.9% of us. Basically, when I say us, I mean every human being, every single thing is made up of mainly space. If you take a look at an atom, majority of it is space. The actual matter in it is very little. Everything vibrates, and if something vibrates, it has a frequency. And and frequencies can align. And so what the thought is that even Einstein talked about is that when we are in alignment with a certain frequency, that's what we attract. So people say there's a frequency for money, right? You have a certain frequency, not just a thought, but what you emit in some way, shape, or form, you have a frequency. Meditation is based on frequency. Our brain waves are based on frequencies. And there's an estimate out there that there's roughly about 157 different frequencies for the universe. We're talking about the universal energy, for example. That's why meditators, they'll say that 432 hertz, for example, is a natural frequency. The earth has a certain frequency. So long story short, what you're saying is when you align with that frequency in your thought and your being, that's what you attract in your life. And you're more likely to not only attract it, but also be aware of it and then attract more of it. And that's why on the flip side, Nathan, when things go bad, right? It's not just one thing that goes bad, it's a series of things that go bad, right? So it works kind of both ways. And then it just kind of snowballs from there. So momentum is important, and getting into that headspace and that frequency is important. And it sounds like you were in that frequency that day.
Yeah, and when you mention things going bad, one thing that I've noticed, and again, completely anecdotal, but sometimes now when something goes bad, I consciously stop and I say, okay, don't let this snowball into a bunch of stuff that goes bad. Accept that something bad happened and try to keep your positive attitude, try to keep a positive momentum going. You hit a road bump or a speed bump, but that doesn't mean you have to completely derail. And man, having that ability to stay positive even when things don't go exactly how you want, there's a lot of power in that.
Yeah, and um, this is why I work with a lot of CEOs. And it's really interesting. I just had a conversation with one yesterday, and he said, "Pretty, this is why I pay you a lot of money, because I always look for the opportunity in every bad situation.
Mm.
And every negative situation or challenge has an opportunity. We just need to be able to tune into that and find out what that is. And if you take a look at everything in your life as an opportunity, well, guess what? You're going to create more opportunities.
Mhm.
And that is one of the secrets to being more successful in life, making more money, having better health, or whatever it may be. There's always an opportunity behind it. I'll give you an example. COVID was one of the best opportunities for me from a health perspective, because ev- most people were like, man, the gym is closed. And I was feeling this way too. I had all the equipment at the gym that I use frequently, and I was like, I can't work out properly. I changed my routine significantly, drastically, I would say, in terms of how I worked out. And I'm way fitter now as a result, because I went from doing heavy weights in a different routine to completely lighter weights. Like my heaviest dumbbell is 20 pounds, which is, light compared to what I used to do. But now I'm way fitter. I have less injuries, for example. I have a heavier weight, more lean muscle mass. Why? Because I was like, okay, how can I use this as an opportunity? So look for those opportunities when you tune into that and you have that frequency. And a lot of guys will get frustrated with this. They'll get so frustrated because they'll have a crappy day and they'll call me up, or they'll send me a message or an email and say, Pradeep, this is happening. And I always ask them, what is the opportunity in this? And it's funny because those guys that have that mindset will structure themselves just like you did and say, I got to change my approach, right? And they're going to come out with a better outcome for sure. 110%. They're going to have a better outcome than the guy that actually sits there and says, let me continue on with this. Whatever, pity party or dealing with challenges or whatever it is, they're not going to find the same opportunity. Some guys won't even respond to that question. They'll just cut me off because they're pissed. They're pissed that I'm asking them this question when they're feeling like crap.
Right. Okay. So over the last two episodes, man, we've kind of gone down a pretty deep rabbit hole. I'm glad we were able to have these two conversations, though. If two things. Number one, if somebody's out there and they're listening to this and they're like, man, this is making so much sense, I need to reach out to Purdeep. How's the best way to get a hold of you?
Best way is just to connect with me on social media. Probably LinkedIn's the best, and email me at team@purdeepsangha.com.
All right. And if they want to check out more episodes of the podcast, the two best places to get more episodes of the Male Entrepreneur Podcast.
Check out malepodcast.com. That's where you can get the audio, and YouTube for Men for our YouTube channel.
All right, man. Thanks again for entertaining this crazy woo rabbit hole that I wanted to go down with you. I got so much out of this conversation, and I appreciate you making yourself available for it.
Yeah, thanks. This has been fun. Let's see what feedback we get. I'll be interested.
All right, man. And until next time, we'll catch you later.
Take care, man.